We are live in the Situation Room with Josh Kaplan, who writes Capital.News, the daily newsletter for all things tech, markets, and freedom. A fellow situation monitor and very well dressed. Josh, welcome to MTS.
Thank you for having me. I had to put on the suit and tie for this occasion.
That's incredible. Yeah, maybe I should be wearing a suit and tie on here. I just
No, you
I
don't
do
need it.
sweaters. I don't need it.
You guys are looking great.
Would it be too LARP because we're so young?
I think so. I think you've got to work up to it. But, if I don't have anything interesting to say, at least people will remember what I look like. So that's the point of looking spiffy.
We'll definitely remember. So tell us about Capital News. What is the newsletter? What is the niche?
So Capital News is literally Elon Musk in the form of a newsletter. Pro tech, pro markets, pro freedom. When I looked across the media landscape, I didn't see any media outlets that covered all three of these buckets in an optimistic perspective. If you look at the Fox Newses of the world, although they are pro market and pro freedom, the vast majority of their coverage is tech skeptical. If you take a look at the vast majority of tech media, ironically, it's either anti tech or anti market, particularly anti-entrepreneur. And so I wanted to amalgamate three of these forces that I think optimize for the best nation, the best America can be, and fold them all into one newsletter. And the way that this differs from most content out there is that this is aggregation across thousands of different sources that I'm hand curating, unlike what you're seeing today, where AI has taken a lot of the editorial legwork and lifting. This is 100% handpicked headlines from across the web. And basically, if you take a step back, when someone is doing curation and they're a single operation, to them, news is like color. So you have to think of yourself less as a journalist or an editor and more as if you're engaging in art. So news stories are colors and a homepage or a newsletter is a canvas. And so every day I get to wake up and paint whatever picture I'm seeing that day, my hopes, my dreams, my aspirations, my fears, my quirks, all of that rolled up into one newsletter.
Mhm. So just diving back into what you said about tech news is either anti-tech or anti-market, anti-entrepreneur. Yes, a lot of tech news is anti-tech. The Verge and like Wired and TechCrunch basically hate technology now. I'm not sure how that happened, but it did happen. But what in like pro tech coverage do you think hates markets or entrepreneurs?
So I would say you have pieces from the New York Times, the Atlantic, more of the establishment press that has traditionally been at least stopped really during the Trump administration, but up until that point were relatively, I would say, neutral or leaning towards being capitalistic and believing in free markets. And now, when you see the ascent of the tech billionaire class, they're starting to chafe a little bit. They're starting to wonder, well, is capitalism working properly when someone like Elon Musk could be on the verge of having trillionaire status? And so they're beginning to rethink the impetus of wanting to cover markets fairly, because they're seeing people who they are adversarial to their way of life and their business um, succeeding so well within this environment. So those are the examples that I would give. I'd say that every other day there's a criticism of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, and yet they've made all of our lives infinitely better, and they're just getting started. And some of these publications are actually owned by the very billionaires that they are so critical of. And so the
Absolutely.
token irony out there, they potentially wouldn't have a job if it weren't for them.
Well, what happened with the Washington Post? Because the Washington Post famously has always been sort of like standard kind of anti-tech, anti-market, like, you know, left wing news. And then Jeff Bezos, who had purchased the Post in 2014, in 2025, he was like, okay, we're taking a firmer editorial line now. We're going to be explicitly pro markets and pro individual liberties. And since then, we just haven't heard that much from the Washington Post op ed column. So, what happened with them?
Well, I think it's really, really difficult to radically transform a newsroom whose incentives are so entrenched to do the very thing that Jeff Bezos tried to do. They're so firmly against that. There was a New York Times report within the past month that did a really deep dive, never before seen um, uh, report on all of the difficulties that Jeff Bezos had in just trying to steer the ship a little bit to the center, and be a little bit more diverse in their coverage, perhaps, cover capitalism in slightly a positive way. And there was, of course, an exodus from the paper. There were editors that Jeff Bezos had to personally intervene to stay in at the Post and to ride it out. And like you said, there's been almost very little coverage coming from the editorial side that's shown that Bezos's changes have actually come to fruition. There have been, some stories peppered in that are pro free speech that took an anti censorship tone. But on the flip side of that is that once you have this issue of an exodus, on the other side of it, it's very difficult to recruit um, elite voices that would share Jeff Bezos's vision, because unfortunately the elite pool has been poisoned against capitalism in large respects. And then on top of that, to be in that position, to go and be the opinion editor or opinion editorial writer at the Washington Post and say really nice things about Trump's golden age, or his energy policies, or the reindustrialization that he's doing, they're going to take a lot of heat. And why would they want that? Perhaps the prestige of the Washington Post is not worth it, and they would rather go to X or Substack and build prestige there.
So, speaking of X and Substack, these seem like kind of the two big platforms right now for individual writers, I would say. Like there's content creators and other domains like video, that's TikTok and Instagram. But writers seem to be more on X and Substack than anywhere else. So what do you think about starting with Substack? Is it in vogue? Is it out of vogue? Is it a platform that more people should be using? What are your takes on Substack?
I think that Substack is dependent on its ridership. And so as long as the people who are there, that they're able to attract, are putting out compelling content that's idiosyncratic to the platform that they can't find anywhere, they'll be in vogue. Whether or not that they can get the business model dialed in, focusing right now exclusively on subscriptions. There's talk that maybe they'll begin to introduce an advertising platform, something like Beehive has. But as long as they begin to continue to attract people who write things that nobody has the freedom or the gumption to write anywhere else, and Substack continues to allow them to build distribution, it will always have a home. I know that there is some criticism that within the past year or two, they've been uh, drilling down on trying to figure out, okay, we've got a lot of center right thinkers and writers on the platform. How do we capture some of this exodus from the corporate media and get them writing over here? So, you see Jim Acosta has gone on there. You see people that have left the Washington Post have gone on there, who really take their center left perspective that they thought was not being, they were not allowed to go as left wing as they wanted at, say, a CNN or Washington Post. And they go to Substack and they post, their resistance style content. And so I think, again, it's going to flourish as long as they're able to attract the most interesting voices in the world. They're able to monetize them, and they're able to afford them frictionless distribution.
Your newsletter is not built on Substack, correct?
No, it's built on Beehive.
Why?
It's built on Beehive because it has a built-in monetization platform. So what Beehive enables you to do is to insert a number of sponsorships of your choosing that they give to you at the beginning of the week. And this immediately allows any single newsletter operator, whether you have 10 subscribers or 10 million subscribers, to begin to monetize very, very quickly. And people in the media space know that the business model is absolutely broken. And one of the great inefficiencies is the sponsorship market. And it's extremely time consuming to go ahead and try to get sponsors, especially if you're not geared towards that. There are people that just simply want to write. I simply just want to edit. I simply want to look outside, look at this tsunami of information, and again, paint the picture of the day that I see fit. I don't want to be spending tons of time reaching out to sponsors and advertisers to try to convince them to sponsor capital.
Makes sense. What do you think about let me put it this way, like, we're building kind of a newsletter internally every day. We have the run of show. We figure out which topics we wanna talk about, and we figure out, like, which tweets are bangers that we wanna go over in the morning segment. So it is kind of similar to a newsletter. And then, of course, we are also building an actual newsletter, which you can subscribe to at mts.now. Uh, so what do you think like, what advice do you have for us in terms of, like, where should we be looking for news stories? How should we be curating them? How do you like pick what's important and what's interesting? What advice do you have for us on that?
So my advice is less tactical and strategic and more esoteric, which I think people at MTS might appreciate. Um, the way that I decide is very simple. Whether a story is going to go into the newsletter or not is I monitor my physical reaction to the news. When you're dialed in, when you're monitoring the situation, not only are you monitoring the information that's existing externally, but I think someone who's truly monitoring the situation is monitoring themselves. How does it feel when a headline comes across my screen? Does the hair stand up on the back of my neck? Does it take my breath away? Do my eyes glaze over? Do I have to read the headline 3 times because it's so unbelievable? That to me is the only bar that I have as to whether or not a story is going into capital. And that's why I think I've been able to curate a really interesting newsletter, is because of um, how much of an emotional attachment I have to the news that I'm putting in there. So if you were able to do that, if you were able to filter out all of the noise, and worry about what people are going to think, I mean, it is cliche, but I do think that we're sort of at the end of advice on things. I feel like Naval and Rick Rubin have really covered it. So Naval says uh, the best strategic advantage you could have is to be yourself. And the more yourself you are, the more you are unlike everybody else. And being singular is a facet and a feature of success. And Rick Rubin, of course, says, well, I never think about the audience. I never think about whether or not someone's going to like a hit. I want to make sure that I like it. I want to make sure that I want to blast this track that I just made as loud as I can in my car for as long as I want. And that is his benchmark. Now, of course, both of these guys are human and they're not always able to do that. And so you're always sort of grasping at a semblance and trying to get as close to that as possible. And it's the way that I write the newsletter. There are moments where I'm like, oh, I don't really care about the story, but it would get a lot of clicks. And if you could build that internal filter and just dial in on what is the one newsletter that I would read the hell out of, nothing else, if I could only read one thing, write that newsletter. Look for news that's going to make you feel that way. Everything else is secondary.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In terms of sources for the newsletter, a lot of it is legacy media, of course. Which legacy media sources would you say are like consistently very good versus inconsistently very good versus not really worth?
So I think it depends on the subject and the topic and the issue area. So I would say that the New York Times the Wall Street Journal is particularly good at blending um, macroeconomic stories with the human interest component. So, for example, there was a recent report that we had linked to that talked about some YouTuber who used to be a car salesman, used to be a car dealer, and he has a YouTube show, and people will pay him up to $1,000, sometimes live, to negotiate with car dealers to get people better deals. And people will pay him like $1,000 or something like that. And so the Wall Street Journal beautifully married this macroeconomic story where inflation is hitting, vehicles are more expensive than they used to be. And then on the flip side, they're bringing it down on a very vivid storytelling level where they're bringing in somebody who is in the thick of it and can actually help you overcome the challenges of buying a car that you may or may not be able to afford without their help. So I would say the Wall Street Journal is absolutely amazing at doing something like that. The Financial Times does amazing reporting on national security issues. So they have a really, really great in today's newsletter. They have a rare behind the scenes glimpse of Iran's hardliners and the infighting that's going on there as they try to negotiate against President Trump. And of course, we almost never get anything that we could trust out of Iran. But this report it's reported out very, very methodically and very, very well. And if you're media literate, you could see um, that there isn't a lot of fluff in here. I mean, what is in there is you could have with a high degree of confidence that it's true. So those are two sources that I really love, and I link to the New York Times every day because I find the New York Times is good with lifestyle stories. And they have a great report about Wine County, up in the north in California, where right now there's a lot of problems with wineries going bankrupt and going through financial hardship. And one of the undertold stories and narratives associated with that story is that there is a ton of fraud. There's fake wines and erroneous labeling and, people saying that this wine is aged for 5 years and really it was just, it was just taken out of the barrel, as soon it was processed. And so I always love these human interest stories, and I think that the New York Times still does a really great job at it.
Yeah, I definitely like the Wall Street Journal, especially for business and finance stuff. I definitely like the New York Times, although their opinion section can be a little slop, and their lifestyle section I would say is very high variance. So it has a lot of great stuff. It also has a lot of sort of frivolous elite nonsense, but even that can be fun to read about. Um, I think my
Right.
favorite legacy media is probably the Financial Times.
It's
Uh,
amazing.
Financial
And
Times is so good.
were you a reader of Lunch With, their Lunch With
Yes,
section?
absolutely.
I love that one. That's some I wish that they leaned more into that. I think that's the type of journalism that the Financial Times is incredible at.
We just did like a whole half hour last week on MTS talking about Dario Amodei on Lunch with the FT. And
Right.
yeah,
Fantastic.
it's such a great touch that they include like, here's the specific restaurant we went to, and here's what we ordered, and here's how much it cost. Like, this is something you can do, right? You can go to the restaurant and order the same stuff.
Right. Yeah. You could be like Dario. You could have a macaroon and you could have an Earl Grey tea. And there's always these very interesting small anecdotes about how they order, what they're wearing. Are they late? Are they early? When and especially they'll describe how they sit down. Do they just plop into their chair, or do they come in, looking composed and suave as if they just had 4 hours of media training? It's a really special type of journalism, and I hope that they continue the section.
Absolutely. Uh, and then final question is, do you think X is still a good platform? How much time are you spending on X? Uh, is it worth it? A lot of people are trashing on X lately. I still think it's pretty good, but what's your take?
I'm with you. It is still pretty good. It is by far the best information ecosystem that we have, despite all of beside all of the pointed criticism. And I think right now the big criticism is that head of product is changing the algorithm in a way in which there are a lot of large accounts that do a lot of aggregation will no longer be able to monetize at the scale that they did. Now, I don't make my income from X. My account is monetized, and so I always made a small sum every couple of weeks. But was nominal for me relative to my greater income. Now, I have to be careful because there are people that spend the vast majority of their time on the platform, and that's where they get the vast majority of their income. So I don't want to come down on people and say, well, actually, this change is better, because I want to be mindful of the people that are super users and it could eat into their income. I think ultimately, I think Tyler Cowen has the best perspective on this, which is X is amazing because X is what you make it.
Totally.
Nobody says that you have to spend your time in the main feed. Nobody says you have to look in the For You tab. You could simply go create a curated list and focus on that your entire day and never see any of the wild and crazy things that X gets complaints for.
Mm. Well, this has been great. Josh Kaplan, thank you so much for coming on MTS.